Hi friends, just Christina back. This is video 3 of the videos that I am presenting to you, breaking down a booklet called The Mark is Ready, Are You by Ron Steele. I'm invoking the fair use right to share this information with you, and I make no money off of this whatsoever, but I think this is very interesting, and I think that you'll be pretty surprised on the views here, and it actually lends merit to the progression of our debit cards and the cashless society. So without further ado, let's get started. Mr. Steele is the Q. Mr. Natter is the A. Mr. N, do you think the Federal Reserve Board is leading up to the invasion of privacy with the Universal Product Code and the point-of-sale terminals that are being piloted throughout the nation at present, which are aiding a checkless and cashless society? And he answers, if you mean the electronic funds transfer system, EFTS, I think it poses a very serious problem. It's really quite complex, but basically it's a system where you don't have to write a check anymore. Your bank balance is deducted in accordance with certain purchases you make in various stores or other purchasing forms. First of all, it will further make more remote the expenditure of consumer money, and they're going to tend to spend money less critically. Everybody knows that you have to pay cash. You're a little more careful than when you write a check. And if you write a check, you're a little more careful than when you have credit. And now this is sort of the ultimate, and I think it has a lot of problems to it. It's going to centralize power in the hands of the banks, most definitely, and everybody's negotiations are going to be recorded. On the other hand, if you abolish currency in the United States, you will abolish a great deal of crime. Mr. Steele says that's an attraction that's going to sell it, and the interviewee agrees and says that's right. So Mr. Steele then says, but do you really think that it's going to come to any good in the end? And Mr. N says, no, I don't think it's going to come to any good in the areas that I mentioned, but I think that it is a very strong argument that if you abolish currency, the holdups, muggings for cash, robberies, and the kind of Watergate corruption, which was finally based on the transfer of cash and envelopes and bribing government officials, its crime is going to be much more difficult. And so it's a strong argument that can be made that a cashless society is going to be one that's going to eliminate a good deal of crime. Not the highest levels of crime, not the antitrust crimes and the corporate suite crimes, but a lot of the political corruption and a lot of the street crime. So this is interesting because when this interview took place, we didn't have the internet. We had 1-800 numbers where if you wanted to order your sea monkeys, you had to send a check in, wait 4 to 6 weeks, and then you'd check your mailbox every day until you finally got it. And now we have a lot of new cyber crime threats, and there's like, I don't know, bitcoins where you can keep your transactions completely private, and there's the dark web, and which I've never used. I'm not really familiar, and I can't give you a tutorial on that. But from what I understand, there's a lot of platforms for this deceit. So it really kind of, this is the basics of the debit card system. And I think that the interviewee is correct because, we don't really tend to think about money when it's on credit. If we have it, then we're going to get it. No, we'll pay it off at another time. And it gets people into a lot of trouble. Americans largely are in debt right now, more so than ever before. And we are not the penny pinching savers that our great-grandparents and our grandparents were. So, all right, on to the interview. So Mr. Steele says, do you think that there is a conspiracy involved behind the Federal Reserve Board in view of what is going on with the system? Mr. N says, the Federal Reserve Board is a conspiracy to begin with. I mean, institutionally, it's a conspiracy. It's, the banks, it's the government, and the bank merger. It's the classical example of it. Our open market policy, for example, is decided by an advisory committee in the various branches of the Federal Reserve who are big businessmen. I think this is a perfect example of the adversary relationship between sellers and consumers. And the sellers know a good thing when they've got it, and they know they can further manipulate the consumer and further control the flow of expenditures with the EFTS. Now, where are the consumers? If you say to 1 million consumers, are you in favor of the EFTS? They say, what's that? Or if you say, are you in favor of the electronic funds transfer system? They say, what's that? It's been around now for several years. It's been written about in all kinds of bank literature and so forth, but it still isn't even an issue in the public forum. I don't know whether there's been a 5-minute documentary on the network news on it, and yet, what is it? So Mr. Steele, so then he continues, it's basically stage 1 to completely automate your purchases so you don't use checks and you don't use cash. So what more intimate things should you be concerned about in the marketplace? Mr. Steele says, I understand that the government is backing this now. The U.S. Air Force isn't issuing checks, and the state of Georgia Social Security is being accredited directly to people's bank accounts, and by 1976 it will become universal throughout the whole U.S. So direct deposits were not a thing back in the day. People found it invasive, they got their checks in the mail, they were happy with that. And now we go as far as having not just our debit card, but we have our store card, so yes, they can see in the bank right away that we spent $58 at Fred Meyer, but then with our Fred Meyer shopper's card, they can see what exactly we spent every single penny on. And that's how they track us. Okay, so in response to the direct deposits, Mr. N says, well, in terms of salaries, that is, you will get your salary paid by Lockheed, for example, by simply a credit to your bank account, rather than sending out a check. Yes, that's getting underway, but the government also has an EFTS commission that it's about to appoint in order to study the problem. At the same time, it's in effect pushing it on all fronts. This is another illustration you see. You start it in motion and then you study it at your leisure. So Mr. Steele says, have you heard of the laser beam marking on the human body? Mr. N says, yes. And Mr. Steele says, could you give reference to this, as I'm interested and I would like to study it further? The answer from Mr. N says, well, let's see. I don't know who there is in an outfit in I don't know who, but there is an outfit in New York that's got all the information, but I don't know the address right now. So maybe that firm in New York is the one who stole Mr. Keith Farrell's designs, huh? I'm sure it has something to do with the government. They're pulling together all the information on EFTS, and it's a commercial operation. Mr. Steele says that brings to mind two extreme views, Professor Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope and the John Birch Society. Where have you heard that before? Do you think that this plays into any of these, and what are your views on these two? So Mr. N replies, well, you see, I don't use the word conspiracy the way that they use the word conspiracy. I use the word conspiracy to indicate an operational union of interest by two groups pursuing a common end against the interest of all the broader public. And the Federal Reserve has always been in bed with the banks. It is of, by, and for the banks, and it is not very dramatic to call it a conspiracy. It may be partially a legal conspiracy, but in common ethics terms, it can be pretty darn bad nevertheless. Because the banks write their own laws, they make conspiracy legal and doesn't make it good. And so finally, they close up by Mr. Steele asking, is this new system going to change the Constitution? And Mr. N says, I don't think so, no. Not the way that it's phrased, no. And that's it. That completes the interview with Mr. Steele and this gentleman who is much older and still very heavy and present in politics. So, all right, thanks for joining me. This is part 3, and we're going to move on to the next phase right away. So just Christina signing out.